Okay, I want to recommend to you now a not just a book, but I suppose it's a whole topic of interest. And you may or may not have come across philosophy and the questions of philosophy, or you may. I think one way or the other, whether you've looked at it formally or not, I'm sure that you have thought about the kind of questions which philosophy tries to answer. Philosophy's been with us for thousands of years, and you might think it started with Socrates or even earlier than that. There's a few pre-Socratic philosophers. All the way through history we've had people who have been philosophers of different kinds. More recently we've had Hume and Locke and Kant and Mill and Berkeley, classic ones. More recently, yet again, we've had Heidegger and Sartre and Foucault and Popper and people like that. All got interesting ideas about all kinds of different things. Where can you find a decent summary of the problems of philosophy encompassing such a large gap? Well, I've got a book here. It's by Bertrand Russell, who was himself a philosopher and a mathematician. And that's the book, The Problems of Philosophy. There's a picture of Bertrand Russell on the front there. And he lived at the end of the, up until the 60s, I think. He lived up until then. And wrote this book a long time ago, about 100 years ago now. 1912 is when it was first published, Problems of Philosophy. And he deals with questions which you may have asked yourself, and questions which you probably didn't even know existed. And that's why I want to recommend this book to you. It's one of those books which pushes back horizons. It opens up vistas. It opens up a whole world of thoughts and ideas that you had never even thought of before. And it just gives you that in a very small compass. It's not a very big book, this. You could read this in a matter of, a few hours and have a vast knowledge of the scope of the main problems of philosophy. So it's a brilliant book. It's written, it says here, for people who have been formal students in philosophy and also the general reader alike. So you don't have to be an expert in this particular field. It deals with such questions as the nature of what is truth and falsehood. It deals with what is knowledge. It deals with induction, scientific method. It deals with idealism. It deals with the nature of matter. It deals with the limits of philosophy and the value of philosophy too. And I was going to read to you a bit from this, a little bit longer passage on this, on appearance and reality, which is a fundamental and important distinction within the world in which we live. How much of what we see is appearance, how much is reality. So from the very start of the book, I'm going to read you probably a fair chunk of this to give you an idea of what the book is like. It comes highly recommended. It's a really very good book, an introduction to questions, not just questions you hadn't thought of, but whole realms that you may not even have been aware of. So any book which can open up a whole new world for you, well, that's worth, a few hours of anybody's time in a lifetime. This is chapter 1, Appearance and Reality. Is there any knowledge in the world which is so certain that no reasonable man could doubt it? Well, the question which at first sight might not seem difficult, well, it's really one of the most difficult which can be asked. When we've realised the obstacles in the way of a straightforward and confident answer, we will be well launched on our study of philosophy, because philosophy is merely the attempt to answer such ultimate kinds of questions, not carelessly, not dogmatically, as we might do in ordinary life, but even in the sciences, but critically, and after exploring all that makes such questions puzzling, after realising all the vagueness and confusion which underlie our ordinary ideas. You see, in daily life, we assume as true many things which, on closer scrutiny, are found to be just full of apparent contradictions, which only a great amount of thought enables us to know what it is that we really might believe in. For example, I'm now sitting in a chair at a table of a certain shape on which I see sheets of paper with writing or print. By turning my head, I can look out of the window and I can see buildings and clouds and sun. I believe that the sun is about 93 million miles from the Earth. It's a hot globe, many times bigger than the Earth. That owing to the Earth's rotation, it rises every morning. It'll continue to do so for an indefinite time in the future. And I believe that if any other normal person comes into my room, he will see the same chairs, tables and books and papers as I see. And that the table which I see is the same as the table which I feel when I press my arm against it. Now all of that seems to be so evident as to be hardly worth stating, except in answer to a man who doubts whether I know anything. And all of that can be very reasonably doubted. All it requires is much careful discussion before we are sure that we have stated it in a form that can be wholly true. Let me explain what I mean. To make our difficulties plain, let's concentrate our attention on the table. To the eye, it's oblong, brown, shiny. To the touch, it's smooth and it's cool and it's hard. And when I tap it, it gives out a wooden sound. And anyone else who sees and feels and hears the table will agree with the description, so that, well, it might seem as if no difficulties could possibly arise. We know what a table is, in other words. But as soon as we try to be more precise, then our troubles begin. Because although I believe the table is really of the same colour all over, the parts that actually reflect the light look much brighter than the other parts, and some parts look white because of reflected light. I know that if I move the parts of the reflector light will be different, and if the apparent distribution of colours on the table change as I move my head. It follows that if several people are looking at the table at the same moment, no two of them are going to see exactly the same distribution of colours, because no two can see it from exactly the same point of view, and any change in the point of view makes some change in the way the light is reflected. So it's evident that what we found then is that there is no one colour which attaches to the table to be the colour of the table, or even of any one particular part of the table. It appears to be different colours from different points of view, and there's no reason for regarding some of these as more really its colour than any other. And we know that even from the given point of view, the colour will seem to be different by different kinds of light, artificial light, or a colour-blind man, or to a man wearing blue spectacles. In the dark there'll be no colour at all, and though to the touch and hearing the table will be unchanged. Now this colour is not something which is inherently in the table, therefore. It's not a part of the table, it's something which depends upon the table and the spectator and the way the light falls on the table. And when in ordinary life we speak of the colour of the table as if it only had one colour, then we only mean the sort of colour which it would seem to have to a normal spectator from an ordinary point of view under normal conditions of light. But all the other colours will appear under other conditions, and they have just as good a right to be considered as real. And therefore we have to ask the question, what colour is the table really? And there's no real simple answer to that. The same is true of the texture. With the naked eye one can see the grain, but otherwise the table looks smooth and even. If we look at it through a microscope, we should see roughness of hills and valleys, and all sorts of differences which are imperceptible to the naked eye. Now which of those is the real table? We're naturally tempted to say that what we see through the microscope is probably more real. But that in turn would change if we had a still more powerful microscope. And if then we cannot trust what we see with the naked eye, well, why should we trust what we see through a microscope? Thus again the confidence of our senses, with which we began with, deserts us. And the shape of the table is no better. We are all in the habit of judging as to real shapes of things. We do this so unreflectingly that we come to think that we actually see real shapes. But, in fact, as we all have to learn as we try to draw, a given thing looks different in shape from every different point of view. If our table really is rectangular, It will look from almost all points of view as if it had two acute angles and two obtuse angles. If the opposite sides are parallel, they will look as if they are converged to a point, away from the spectator. If they're of equal length, they will look as if the nearer sides were longer. Now, all of these things are not commonly noticed when looking at a table, because experience has taught us to reconstruct the table in our mind as the real shape of the apparent shape, and the real shape is what interests us as practical men. But the real shape is not what we see. We construct that real shape in our minds. It's something inferred by what we see, and what we see is constantly changing in shape as we move about the room. So, here again, the senses seem not to give us the truth about the table, but only the appearance of the table. And then he goes on to say the same thing about the difficulties that arise under senses of touch and feeling. What is the real table? What is the difference between the appearance and the reality? When you look at things from a purely scientific point of view, you find actually that if you were to zoom in on it from a physicist's point of view, and you zoom right the way down to the quantum level, you find that mostly the table is just air. The gaps between the atoms is actually vast, like the gap between a sun in the solar system and a planet in the solar system. It's just a big empty space, mostly, and yet it seems hard to us. Which is the real table? How do we determine the difference between appearance and reality? How do we construct the reality from the appearance that we're left with? Well, these are the kind of problems which Bertrand Russell has left us with in this book here. So I advise you to pick up a copy if you're interested at all in philosophy. It's a wide-ranging book, and yet it's in a very short compass. Problems of Philosophy, Bertrand Russell. I read it when I was about 20. Highly recommended to you as well.